gentlemen, and welcome to Bank of Baroda Baitak. And now for session 182 on your program sheets, Brothers of the Gun, an illustrated collaboration with Syrian war journalist Marwan Hisham, which is also a semi-finalist for the 2018 National Book Award. Please help me welcome on stage the author, Molly Crabapple, who will be in conversation with William Seagard. Thank you.
Well, hello everyone. Good afternoon. To what
Hello.
feels like probably the last event of the festival on a rather chilly Monday afternoon. I feel like saying, gather round, come closer, come and sit in a few rows closer, otherwise you're all so far away. We'll make a little bit more of a community of it. Not last, but best. You're right. You're right. Anyway, we're very grateful to have you here, and I'm very grateful to have a chance to talk to Molly Crabapple. And I don't know how many of you have had a chance to read her books, but they are rather amazing. And I think, just to begin with, Molly, I'm going to ask you a little bit of background about Molly and how it all began. When you were a little girl, because not only you're a very gifted artist, but you're also a very gifted writer, what was going on at home that stimulated all of this? Were your parents all creative all around you?
I think I had a very lucky combination of parents. My mother is an amazing illustrator. I always say that she draws the way that I would if I wasn't black-hearted and broken inside. She draws like I would if I was a nice person. And when I was a little girl, my mother would sit with me and she would draw with me. And she would tell me, that's not how you draw a sky. People's noses don't look like that. And she would keep me from making childish mistakes in my work. But even more important than that, and this is the real gift my mother gave me, so many people don't think you can make a living as an artist. They think that either artists starve or else artists are some aristocrats somewhere. Whereas my mother, because she is an illustrator, taught me that a perfectly middle class or lower middle class living could be yours if you just drew pictures every day. She taught me that artist or illustrator was a totally reasonable, prosaic, and adult aspiration. And as for my father is he's a professor of Puerto Rican studies, and he's a Marxist. And I think growing up in a home where I was always taught to question authority, and where I was always taught that sort of the dominant system that things ran in America might just be full of hokum, that was something that influenced me greatly as well.
So there you are. I think what strikes me as a result of this influence is the complete lack of self-consciousness about your work, both your style of writing and the way in which you draw, that easy flow. In some ways, you've been incredibly lucky not to have these barriers. Does this also come from your mum, do you think?
Writing is not easy for me. There's not a single sentence I've ever written that I haven't written and rewritten and rewritten and edited and bled over. I'm definitely one of those writers who, as they say, likes having written but hates the act of writing itself. But drawing, I suppose, I mean, it was just something I did, right? And it took me a long time to get good. I certainly was not one of those, young prodigies. But now I can draw like I breathe. But I think perhaps more what you're talking about is that sometimes I feel like people who have gone through these, master's programs at these very elite schools to be painters, they're like creatively constipated, They spend so long thinking about the perfect artist statement they're going to make about the, steel cube that they're going to put somewhere. And I'm like, no, how can you be that way? For me, the essence of being an artist, of being a writer, it's the work that you do. It's doing it every single day, and it's the craft that you do. It's not like you just sit in a room and you masticate over an idea like an oyster does a pearl. It's everything else too. It's the act of doing it.
And also, your art is part of the life around you, rather than art that is separate from the world. And that seems to be very significant. Let's carry on. So you get to your teenage years, and then astonishingly, I read at the age of 17, you've left home. You're not just left home, you've left America, you've gone to Paris, and then you end up in Morocco, And then at 18, you're in Istanbul, and you're traveling alone. I mean, it's an incredibly brave thing to do for someone at that sort of age and stage.
I don't know if it's that brave to travel alone. I mean, I think that the way I was raised, I don't know if this is the case for, in India, but the way I was raised is I was taught that the world was basically this incredibly frightening place where anytime a girl went outside, she could be raped, and that the best thing that you could do to protect yourself was just to stay inside and be very quiet and never drink any alcohol or wear any short skirts or annoy anyone. And I was just like, that sounds terrible, that's not a full way to live a life. And I think that a lot of times there are two different things in the world. There's the sort of danger that women actually face, which is very real, but there's also the other thing, which is the myth of the danger we face. The idea that there's just this sort of, miasma of horror facing us at any particular moment. And I think that myth is very destructive. It's something that's actually been invented by the patriarchy to keep us shackled at home like passive good girls. And I don't actually think it was that dangerous for me to travel to most of the places that I went. But I think that getting over that myth was something very liberatory.
Well, I think in some senses, because I've been to some of those places, you're probably not being entirely honest. You're just a courageous person. Because actually being a single woman traveling in Eastern Turkey or in those sorts of places in those days, and probably today...
A year after the truce? Yeah, that was dangerous.
Yeah, I think so. But in all of this traveling, and as you're drawing everything around you, because that's what's so remarkable looking at your work, wherever you go, that's your subject material, you get increasingly politicized, and you want to learn Arabic, and you teach yourself, and so tell us a little about all of that.
I always took a sketchbook around with me. In part, I think I took the sketchbook because it was an excuse to look. In New York, when I was, like a 16-year-old girl sort of hanging around, I was very scared to look because I thought if I look, then men will think I'm interested in them and they'll bother me. But if I had a sketchbook, I could be like, no, I'm looking because I'm an artist. This is my excuse and my lockpick. And it's also as a way for people who maybe I wouldn't have been able to talk to be interested in me. And so when I traveled, I also drew. I drew every single day, at every single moment. I would just plunk down on the corner of the street, and I would try to capture the scene that was in front of me. It became a way that I met people, I met street kids. I just met random people because I had my sketch pad. And in terms of being politicized, I came from a leftist home, right? And I, of course, protested the Iraq War and all of that. But I started to include my politics in my work during Occupy Wall Street, which was a movement in the US against financial corruption and against what happened after our financial collapse, which was that the people who lost their homes, they just lost their homes, but the banks got a lot of money to give their well-paid employees bonuses. So I took part in this movement, and I started drawing it, and I think that gave me courage to do more political work. And then I got arrested, and I was very angry about that, and I drew and I wrote about my arrest. And I suppose that was the thing that sort of initiated me into the act of writing for other people to see.
And that also, by the sounds of things, made you feel that you wanted to go beyond, Occupy New York and your own local political issues, but the political issues on a global scale.
I think that everyone who was at Occupy, we felt that we were but one event in what I called the rebellions of 2011, which was a series of rebellions that included the Arab Spring and also the anti-austerity protests in Greece and in Spain, the student protests, though those happened, in late 2010. And at that time, people like Egyptian activists would visit us in New York, and New York activists would go to Greece, and there was this huge sense of international solidarity. And after the police crushed Occupy, I suppose I felt, I think the first time that you get involved in a political moment like that, it's like a romance, you feel like love with all of the craziness and the irrationality that implies. And I think when Occupy was crushed and when the mini city we built in the square was dismantled, I was still looking for that. I was still looking for that love. And so I went to other places where things were still happening. And I went to Greece, and I went to Spain at first. And from the experience of writing, I got an addiction to it. I started to love the fact that journalists can go anywhere and that they can question authoritarian bastards and that they can sneak through holes in fences and they can ask anyone anything and it's all right because you're a journalist. And so I started doing that more and more.
But you also, as an artist, can do things other people can't do because you can draw things that we're not allowed to photograph. So it's a combination of the two, isn't it, that makes such a sort of magical pairing, really, because you've gone into places like Guantanamo Bay and drawn things rather like an old-fashioned court illustrator would or whatever. And that fusion of the two is really, really exciting. It's like two forbidden zones brought together.
Exactly. I mean, with photography, it's actually, in some ways, quite easy to censor photography. You get a metal detector, you look through people's bags, You can take someone's phone after, if you catch it on them and look through it and delete things, right? It's something particularly easy at like a checkpoint, a prison, military zone. But art is very slippery. All you need for art, right, is you need, a piece of paper and you need a pen. That's it. And your memory and your eyes. That is something much, much, much harder to put a hold on, which is, I think, why prisoners throughout time have done so many drawings of their incarcerations. I went to Guantanamo Bay in 2013. It may sound very, very difficult or brave, perhaps, but the military actually has junkets for this. They had the motto at the time, safe, legal, transparent, humane. And I went with the rest of the journalists, and I drew the 9/11 pretrial hearings, and also this prison where over 700 Muslim men, almost all of them innocent, had been tortured. I drew the force-feeding chair, I drew the cells, I drew the cultural...
How did you get access to these places?
I went with the military. The military, they have a tour for the press.
And while you were quietly sketching, did someone just want to grab the sketches or tear them up or destroy them?
I had permission to. I think that once they saw what I was sketching, though, they got very angry. For instance, one of the ways that Guantanamo does censorship is that for a photographer, they're like, oh, you're welcome to take photos. Please, come. But you can't take photos of more than one door. Okay, I move my camera here. Oh, and you can't take photos of any security cameras. Oh, I move my camera down. And no one's faces. I move my camera more down. Oh, all I can take a photo of is the floor. That's how it works there. And what I did was, I was like, I'm not interested in drawing the locations of your security cameras. I'm not interested in drawing whatever teenagers you have as guards. I'm interested in drawing this. I'm interested in drawing this machine where people were tortured and detained for no reason. And so, for instance, when there were guards, I would replace their heads with a blank mask, just like a smiley face with, line for the mouth. And I think that they were kind of disconcerted by this because, first of all, it's actually a much bigger statement on the interchangeability of the torturers than drawing people's faces. But also, it makes the censorship explicit. It doesn't hide the censorship. It makes it obvious what they're doing.
And before you went to Guantanamo Bay, you were obviously aware of everything that was going on. But seeing the physical reality of it, did that have an enormous impact on you?
My God, of course it did. I once said that Guantanamo is where the American ability to be nice goes right against the American inability to be good. By that I mean it's a place very cheerful, If you go there, there'll be like a nice young man from Tennessee, and he'll be helping you and everything. But it's also a place where, people have been indefinitely detained and horribly tortured. And there's absolutely no guilt of that at all. Its slogan is honor bound to defend freedom. And I think the thing that hit me wasn't just the crimes that were done in Guantanamo, which are very, very real, but it was the complete lack of irony or remorse.
So all the way along, Morocco, Turkish zone, Guantanamo Bay, builds up and builds up and builds up, and then the Syrian war starts. And your second and your new book is all about the Syrian war. Talk us through how you ended up going there, being part of it, and also then we'll go a little bit into the process of how you put the book together.
I started covering the Syrian war in late 2013, and primarily from the angle of the refugee crisis, rather than from the angle of embedding with fighters, for instance, like many of my colleagues did. Originally, I first went to Lebanon, where there were many refugees living in camps in the Bekaa Valley, and also who were living in Tripoli in the north. And I think the thing that, the reason I kept covering it was that what happened in Syria at the start was a revolution, even though obviously it was hideously co-opted by some of the worst people on earth and also brutally crushed. And I remember I was meeting people in these camps, and I met this older woman, and she was living, she was like renting a floor in a half-built building with her family, and her husband, he had no legs because he had diabetes, and he hadn't been able to get insulin. And she's there with like her family and her kid, and she was just one of these she's just a cool woman, she's like a tough, working class, funny, sarcastic, like spine like iron type woman, really, really an amazing person. And she had been working as a field nurse for a rebel group, and she had only decided to leave Syria because of her husband lost his legs, and she had a son who was missing in government prisons, and I was there right after the famous Obama Red Line thing, and she was asking why the world wasn't doing anything. And I of course, as someone who spent a lot of time protesting against the Iraq War, I was like, well, it's because America doesn't do good things. America, when it intervenes, it destroys countries. Look at Iraq. And she didn't really like my answer very much, and I wasn't even satisfied with my answer. And I think what kept driving me to come back and to keep covering Syria was that even if I had no answers at all, which I still don't, I didn't know what to tell her, and I didn't know what I could even feel right telling her.
But actually, America's role in Syria wasn't as significant, as you might say, as it was in Iraq or anything else. So there's more to it than just American foreign policy in your fascination and in your concern. And also there's this acute interest because of your knowledge of Arabic. You've been to Gaza, you've been to all sorts of places. I mean, as somebody who works in the Middle East, you don't come across many people from the United States who have traveled as well as you have, and as knowledgeable and as well informed as you are on those subjects. And to be doing that at such a young age and from an artist's background is also rather extraordinary as well.
Thank you. I've studied Arabic for the past 6 years. Anyone in this audience who speaks Arabic, if I tried to speak to you, you would laugh at my accent. It's pretty pitiful, but I love Arabic literature, and one of my great satisfactions has been I've even been able to publish some translations of it, and especially of the Syrian short story master Zakaria Tamer. And I think that what drew me to keep reporting on Syria, and also I did murals at schools for refugees. I reported on refugees in Iraq, in Lebanon, and Turkey. I snuck into camps in Greece. I went into Syria for one day because I am not as brave as many of my colleagues are, and at that time there was a lot of kidnapping, so I didn't spend longer. But I think it was a mixture of admiration for a lot of the people who were initially involved in the revolution, a feeling that the entire world had betrayed Syria in a profound way, and making friends. I think that those were the three things I would say.
And how did you end up making a book?
In 2014, ISIS, the Islamic State, had conquered the city of Raqqa in Syria, and it had imposed a brutal occupation on the city. And there was this guy that was tweeting. He was tweeting about Raqqa from inside it, and he was, just a Syrian guy. And I was like, what the hell? How is this even happening? How is this happening? And I started talking to him, and he was a young...
Talking to him on Twitter?
Talking to him on Twitter DMs. And he was a young man who had graduated from the University of Aleppo with a degree in English literature, had a fondness for Ernest Hemingway, and had stayed in Raqqa to protect the family property. And originally, I got to know this young man, Marwan Hisham, because he was a source for some of my articles. But as we were talking, and also as he was helping me with my Arabic, I asked him, I said, Marwan, do you have any photos of Raqqa? I didn't mean like go out and take photos. I meant, do you have the sort of photos we all have right on our phone? And he said, no, but I could take some for you. And I say, that's very dangerous, isn't that? And he's like, nah, don't worry about it, it's my city. And lied to me. He straight up lied. It was very dangerous. He was risking his life. But he went out and he took these photos that were both meant to counteract the idea that Raqqa, the place where he was born, had never been anything but a war zone, but also to counteract the ISIS propaganda, that this was some sort of, Muslim utopia. He took photos of kids digging through the trash for things to sell and of bread lines, but also of a park where people used to, hang out and have dates back in the day. And he gave me these photos, and I drew from them, and he wrote captions, and we published them in Vanity Fair. And it was such an amazing thing for me because there are so many things that make an American journalist not go to Raqqa. For instance, the fact that we would be beheaded if we went there, or the fact that we would be charged as terrorists if we somehow got out. I mean, everything in the world, most particularly ISIS, would prevent me from ever being allowed to see that place. And yet, here I was. He was doing me the immense favor and giving me the gift of allowing me to see through his eyes.
And when you say published in Vanity Fair, you went and took it to Vanity Fair and said, there's a piece in this, will you publish it?
Exactly.
So that began the most extraordinary collaboration with somebody the other side of the world who you'd only met on Twitter. Tell us what happened next.
After it came out, I mean, we were both so high on it, right? Like, we both felt that we had put up this big fuck you to the world, like to Borders, to this disgusting fascist organization, and that we had made something together, like we'd made art out of hell. And we repeated this twice more. Once Marwan went to Mosul, which was also occupied by ISIS, and once in East Aleppo, which was held by rebels. And by this time, I was like, Marwan, we're doing something different, something no one else has done or thought to do. And also, I started really respecting him as someone who's brilliant and had an incredibly unique take on the world, and also a literary education I myself lack. And I was like, Marwan, we should do a book together. We can do something together big. And I told him, like, you can't stay in Raqqa, though, to do this. You cannot type a book on your phone, so you have to go to Turkey. And he snuck across the border, and we spent the next 2.5 years writing our book, Brothers of the Gun, which is his memoir of the Syrian war, revolution, life under Assad, and also life under ISIS, and something we co-wrote together, and I did 82 illustrations, which is the same number of prints in Goya's Disasters of War.
So now, you just quickly glided over, he snuck over the border. Which border to where?
He snuck over the border between Syria and Turkey, which I wouldn't say it was quickly. I would say that at that time the Turkish border guards were beating the crap out of anyone who they caught.
So you managed to get down to the border district from Istanbul or Ankara or whatever to meet him?
No, I met him in Istanbul.
You met him in Istanbul.
Yeah.
So he got up to Istanbul and met you. So you just, let's have a bit more picture painting around it. What was it like meeting him for the first time in the flesh?
Oh, it was crazy. I mean, I think we were both so nervous we could barely speak, and his spoken English wasn't so easy then because he had never really spoken, to someone who spoke English as a native language before. He had taught himself English, and then he had studied it in university. But his English was like, I'm going to translate Waiting for Godot and read Marlowe. It wasn't, like I'm gonna, talk smack with a New Yorker. You know what I mean? And so, but we just really liked each other. And he had all these notes that he had made on his phone for a book that he wanted to do. And so we took all the notes and we were like, okay, what do we need? How do we fill this in? Like what information, who are our characters? How does this work? And we made lists and we plotted. And I remember I interviewed him because I was trying to write a fill-in sort of chapter. And I was asking him about what it was like when he got out, you know, because by that time ISIS was, I mean, he was afraid that he was on like a wanted list, and you know he might have been killed at a checkpoint. And I was interviewing him, and he's so like, sarcastic. He has a very, very black, morbid, witty, and cynical sense of humor. And he's just describing this ISIS guy at a checkpoint who's wearing like so many layers of like military gear and like a suicide belt, and he looks like a marshmallow man with like little, you know, his little stubby, stupid head and hands, and he's just describing this, and I'm interviewing him, and I'm like, how high is the checkpoint? What were you thinking? And we're going back and forth, and it felt high. We just like clicked, you know?
So you're sketching from his description, not from photographs?
Well, this I was actually writing, and then I gave him what I wrote, and he would rewrite it. And then I would rewrite it, and he would rewrite it. And everything in the book was done in this way. It was he would write, or I would write, and then we would each add to each other's writing. And very often we would like fight. We would fight like cats over it. And but we made something that every single sentence was kind of a fusion of both of ours. And
but there were images as well?
Yes, 82 images. And for these images, I couldn't rely on photos like I had in the beginning, because, you know, he's talking about things that there weren't photos of, like when he was a little boy in religious school, for instance. So instead, I would interview him and, you know, be quite detailed, like how many guys were in this cafe? What did they wear? What did they look like? You say this guy is injured. How was he injured? How did he sit? Was he happy, sad, you know? And Marwan would describe it. He would get me any photo reference he could. So, you know, if he found a picture of the type of energy drink a guy liked, for instance, or of his school courtyard on Google Images, or what type of vest someone wore. And I would do sketches. He might do sketches. I would give him my sketches, and he would tell me, this is crap, this looks like you copied a Virgin Mary painting, what is this cliche, oh my God. And, you know, I would do the sketches over and over again to try to, he called it downloading his memories.
And where is Marwan now?
He's in Ankara right now.
Okay, so he's safe and sound?
Yes, yes.
And how has the book been received in that part of the world?
Well, we did one event in Turkey. Because Marwan is Syrian, he can't travel, and that's not just because of
President Trump.
Yeah, it's not just because of President Trump. It's 3 different countries. It's the Syrian government. It doesn't renew passports of people who are on its bad list, or if it does, it's for an extremely, extremely substantial bribe. And also, Turkey doesn't give permanent residence documents anymore. So, you know, you can leave Turkey and then maybe end up living in an airport for 7 months like Hassan al-Kuntar did in Malaysia. So, you know, he couldn't travel for the book tour, so we did one event in Istanbul together. And that was very interesting because in Turkey, unfortunately, there's a real... Syrian refugees are in a very difficult situation, which is that Erdogan is sort of positioning them as like, oh, these are our poor, you know, Islamic brothers who it's our duty to help, blah, 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 and saying things that are like kind of very nice but very condescending, and just because of the perception that they're Muslim. Which has led to the opposition parties, sadly, except for the HDP, being explicitly racist and talking about deporting them all. And it is a situation where Syrians very often who would not normally support Erdogan feel like if any other party came into office that they would be deported back to their deaths. And because of this, a lot of Syrian intellectuals, like this sort of, a lot of Turkish intellectuals, like this sort of people who would be at the Turkish equivalent of this, a lot of them really look down on Syrians, and a lot of them have no Syrian friends. They don't know there are Syrian intellectuals. They don't know that there are Syrians that aren't impoverished pro-Erdogan religious fundamentalists, and they basically just have a huge separation that they're not interested in bridging. So in Istanbul, we did an event with a wonderful Turkish art magazine, and the audience was mostly Turkish, and I felt like it was something that actually had the possibility to change this, because it's a ridiculous dynamic. It's ridiculous to act like just because of people's, you know, race or nationality that they can't be people who are politically on your side. It's ridiculous to force them to side with a fascist, you know?
Yes, I agree. Before all of this, you had other worlds that you explored. You became a dancer, you became a burlesque artist, and you did a lot of drawing, and you built up in a way, perhaps one of the most exciting in your early career stages was painting this thing called the box. Tell us a bit about that.
Well, I was always obsessed with this very famous French 19th century painter named Toulouse-Lautrec, who was known for his paintings of a cabaret named the Moulin Rouge, with can-can girls and performers. And it was very interesting how he approached it, because he didn't approach it like, oh, pretty girls, vapid things. He approached it like class war, you know? Like, here are these tough working class performers who are against all odds and in defiance of all power, who are carving out a space for themselves where they are queens. And I had always been attracted to the nightlife for that. So I worked as a dancer when I was younger. I wasn't good at it. I'm actually terrible, actually, but I wanted to hang out backstage and draw, and that's how I did it. But there was this nightclub called The Box that was the sort of place where the incredibly rich people who destroyed our world went to spend $10,000 on a bottle of champagne. And it had performers, and they were amazing. They were like fire eaters and drag queens and acrobats, naked dancers, little people, everything. And the acts were transgressive and mean and brilliant. And I had a friend who was performing there, so one day my friend invited me, and I sat in the corner and I drew, just like I always draw. And one of the owners came up and he saw me drawing, and he invited me to come back. And I fell in love with that place. And it was a complicated sort of love, because it was a place that catered to the worst people in the world, quite frankly. But it had the most amazing people performing there. And it was a place where like these two different classes of people sort of just like, I kind of came into conflict, but also desire all at once. And I became the house artist there. And I drew, and I drew there. I convinced them to make their symbol a pig snorting cocaine. That's what I thought of their audience.
But there's something transgressive in itself in being able to paint a radical canvas amongst what's really quite an establishment audience, isn't there?
That's what I was trying to do. When I was asked to paint the walls of their club in London, I painted a traditional British fox hunt with the fox hunters as pigs, and the fox is a man. And it's in a rotunda, and they're chasing this man, you know, they're hunting him up, and he goes up the stairwell with all these performers, and I do the performers as gods, like twice the size of him. And then by the time he gets out the other end of the stairwell, he comes out as a pig who's thrown on to join the hunt.
What's so extraordinary about you, Molly, well, one of the many things that's extraordinary, is that you're only 31, is that right?
I'm 35.
35, but you've packed more experiences in that 35 years than most of the rest of us would have done in a number of lifetimes. You know, if I listed the different sort of jobs, places you've been, experiences you've had, really quite frontline experiences, countries you've visited, war zones, you've been to Gaza. I don't know how you managed to get to Gaza, because it was almost impossible to get to Gaza, but somehow you pulled that off. And you've drawn everything. So you've added to your vernacular in there, these things from all over the world and everything else. What's going to come next in the next few years?
I mean, you never know, really. The world changes so fast and it moves so quickly, and I think a part of my art is that it's quite reactive to that. It's quite greedy to draw what comes next. The project I'm working on right now is, my great-grandfather was part of a revolutionary group back in Russia in, at the turn of the 20th century. And it was an interesting group. It was Jewish, it was anti-Zionist, and it was socialist. And it was called the Bund. The Bund, yeah, the Bund. And I wrote about this group because it was a group that was morally right at so many crucial junctures of the 20th century, from rejecting Stalinism to rejecting settler colonialism in Israel, but was crushed by the Nazis, by the Soviets. Physically, they were murdered by those groups, but also it was erased from memory by sort of the official Israeli state narrative, because it was an anti-Zionist group. And I wrote an article about this, about the Bund. And more people read it, and it meant more to people than I think anything I've yet done. And so many family members of these revolutionaries got in touch with me, thanking me for, saving their grandfather or their grandmother's memory from the black hole of history. And so I think I want to write my next book on this group. And they were such an important group because what Israel tells to Jews is it tells them that there are two options in the world. It's either be how your grandparents were and be weak and passive and die, get killed, right? Walk to the gas chambers, they tell us, walk to the gas chambers like sheep. Or else the other option is to, move to Israel and press Arabs. It's a dichotomy that many ethno-nationalists have posed, either be weak and die or be strong and oppress others. And I think I liked the Bund because the Bund, it rejected that, but it was strong. It was a group that said, no, we are not going to go somewhere else to escape the oppression that we're facing in Europe. Instead, we're going to pick up guns and we're going to tell the racists that this is our land too and they can't kick us off of it.
And is there any illustrative material for you to play with so that you can fire your imagination to draw?
There's so many amazing historical photos of it, and it's such a rich vocabulary. And I will draw with it, but I think it's going to be primarily written.
Okay. So, and is that a sense that you have about yourself as well, as that ultimately we may be reading your books with no images in them at all?
Maybe. I don't know. I feel like when I publish books with images that sometimes people, this happened with Brothers of the Gun. Because I'm an artist, sometimes media would deny that I wrote it. It's like a lot of times media wants to keep you in boxes and say, oh, you just draw so you can't write. And there is a part of me that wants to say, like, to hell with you. Actually, I can write, and you don't need my images, to sweeten it. But I also love to draw, so I don't know.
Well, good. I'm so pleased. Don't give up on the drawing side of things, because once again, these whole areas of the world which are quite forbidden, and you have the courage to go and visit them and be part of them. And we need them drawn to life, just to give a sense beyond words. So I think the fusion of the two is very powerful, and certainly be sad if you only became a writer. I say only. We're here to celebrate. We love our writers. Okay, now, we've got down to our last, yes, hands are already primed. It's very exciting. Can we have the microphones? Good. Hopefully we'll have time to answer everyone's questions, as we haven't gotten a full audience. Who's going first? You, sir.
So tell us more about the kind of audiences that would come in at the box, because you said these were really, bad people, and they would spend a lot of monies on a bottle of champagne. Tell us more about them, your experiences while you were at the box with these sort of people, as well as the owner of the box and things of those sorts.
You want to know more about the horrible people?
Well, not everyone was bad. I shouldn't say that. However, the sort of like hedge fund, people and like financiers that destroyed our economy were certainly partying extensively and wasting their ill-gotten gains at the box. I don't know. I was there because I was fascinated, right? And also because it was my job. And I think there's always been a part of me that wants to draw the hidden things in this world. And, in some ways the hidden things might be like a prison, but in other ways it might be how the most extreme elite of the world conducts itself like a bunch of swine in a very privileged place where they didn't think anyone was watching.
Yes, where are the microphones gone? Yes, could you, this gentleman was first. Yes, here we are.
Molly, I bought your memoir after the travel session, and I couldn't read it because the pictures were so beautiful. Yeah. I just couldn't read it. I've gotten around to not gotten around to reading it because it's just so beautiful. You keep on looking at it. Congratulations.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Right. So no, this reinforces what I'm saying.
Not to become a grubby writer like the rest of everyone. Is that what you're saying?
Well, not just a writer, but be confident that your readers love your writing. And as I said, what I'm delighted about your writing is you completely unself-conscious. It feels like that, even if you have to wring it out of yourself. But don't lose the images, because, they're remarkable as well, and this gentleman just told us. Yes,
Thank
sir.
you.
How did you get into Gaza, and what did you find when you got there?
I applied for a press pass. That's the simplest thing. It's called a GPO card. You get an outlet. You get a letter from a media outlet. I don't think I said I was going to Gaza on the letter, because the GPO card is also something you might use to get into concerts for free. You know, it's just a card that says you're media. And then I had a translator I worked with who took care of my paperwork with Hamas. When I was in Gaza, I was reporting about the Shujaiya neighborhood, which is a neighborhood that during Operation Protective Edge in 2014, Israel completely decimated. They bombed it, they drove tanks through it, they shot it, they bulldozed it. They tried to wipe this from the face of the earth. And because Gaza is under a blockade, as I'm sure you all know, it is not a place that is rebuilt. And many, many countries pledged a great deal of money to rebuilding Shujaiya, and after they got in the media for doing this, they didn't give the money. So, you know, it's a place where people were really living in the ruins of their homes that Israel had destroyed. And I think the thing about Gaza that struck me the most is that it's so small. It's a place that you can see almost all of it when you stand on the highest point, and because of that, it's a prison. People aren't allowed out. On one side, their prison guards are Egypt. On the other side, their prison guards are Israel. And people live and die in this very small, increasingly polluted, increasingly toxic spot of land that Israel bombs so often that it doesn't even make the news very often when they do. And yet, they were some of the toughest, most dignified, and most sarcastic people I have ever met. So that's my opinion of Gaza.
Just a quick question. Can you explain to me the dichotomy of right-wing Jews being okay with Netanyahu cozying up to Holocaust deniers? Like, how does that work, right? Because right-wing Zionist Jews are all about the strength of Israel. Israel needs to be strong and powerful. We need to remember the Holocaust. Then how can you turn around and be like, oh, Netanyahu is cozying up to Orban. That's cool. Let's go along with that. Like,
it's because it's the ethno-nationalist way. Like, the ethno-nationalists, they don't actually care about every single member of the ethnic group. They don't care about, in my opinion, the Netanyahu government doesn't care at all about liberal Jews in America, as you could tell by their behavior after 11 of us were massacred at a synagogue. They care about themselves and their own power, and they only care about Jews if they're carrying a gun or making a baby or sending a check to Israel. And so for Jews in the diaspora, right, like the Hungarian, Jews that are currently suffering under Orban, they don't matter because they're not in Israel. They're not building they're not taking part in this extremely authoritarian and racist, system. And I think it's not something that's exclusively limited to Israeli thinking. I think many ethno-nationalist governments take part in this, but that's why they don't care about the liberal diaspora. They only care about themselves and their own state.
I think there's one more element to this, which is that I think the writing is on the wall, and he is on his way out over the next 18 months, and he hopes to do two things, I think, in that process, in what he might call his legacy. One is to outgun Ben-Gurion in terms of how long he's prime minister. But the second one is making these relationships with new countries around the world, that he wants to be remembered as the man who opened those countries' doors. Madam.
Thank you so much. I'm wondering what your relationship is to your nationality and how that might have shifted over the course of all of your international political action.
It's an interesting question. I'm American. My father is from Puerto Rico, which is a colony, but it's a colony where it's American colony, but Puerto Ricans have American citizenship, but it's still somewhat of an immigrant experience for Puerto Ricans to come to America, not the least because they don't typically speak English as a first language. I'm from New York, and I feel like a New Yorker in my bones. It's where I was born. It is a city that I admire in so many ways for all of its inequalities and flaws, and for all the ways that it's being hollowed out inside by the forces of gentrification. It's the place I love. I don't know America in a lot of ways, and this is something that I've started to realize. America is a huge country. It's a very, very diverse country. You can't say that the life of someone who's living in rural Montana is the same as the life of someone who is living in an Arab neighborhood in Brooklyn, you know? And while I love more than ever my city, I've increasingly realized how little I know my country.
Yes. Yes, this gentleman here. Come to you next.
Yeah, hi Molly. After all, you're an artist. So how hard it was to practice your artwork in between all the warfield and bloodshed? How tough it was for an artist to work?
Well, it's, you know, art is interesting. Here's something where art is very different than writing. To write, if you're a fiction writer, you need, what did Virginia Woolf say? You need a room of your own, or you need a laptop. Whereas to be an artist, you need materials, you know? You need space, you need a big piece of wood, you need nice paints, you need a lot of stuff. And because of that, art has in many ways been more confined by class and by money than writing has. Though, you know, obviously the publishing industry is quite classist too. And it was very hard to get my start as an artist in New York. I don't have a college degree, let alone one from a nice school. I don't have any, you know, family connections to anything. America is not a country that gives grants to individual artists. So it was very hard, and it was a lot of struggle, but it was what I wanted more than anything in the world, and I feel very grateful I got it.
Yes, there's a hand over here. Yes, this lady here.
Thank you. I wonder if you could talk some more about art, and you've talked about its role in making the hidden visible, but art can do a lot of things that words can't do. I wonder if you could talk about that.
One of the things that doing a drawing does is you can see the person's hand in it, right? You're doing something that's quite new to people. Like all of us, you know, whether or not we're writers here, we all have the experience of writing because we went to, you know, school and we went to university and we write emails to people. And writing, just the act of like making words, putting them before the other on the page, is a pretty basic thing that we all just sort of do as, you know, as part of our daily lives. Whereas most people haven't drawn since they were little kids. And most people are never drawn except maybe when they're on vacation, right? And someone, you know, does their caricature. So drawing is something that's quite apart from most people's lives and something that a lot of people are quite scared or intimidated to do. And I think that's also something that makes it special and precious and rare. And it's something that changes people's reactions to you when you're drawing in public or when they see a drawing. It's also something where you can transcend borders, you can transcend languages, you can speak to people directly that you can't speak to with words for any sort of reasons. And finally, what I would say about visual art is that it short circuits a lot of the defenses people have. It's not something where, you know, you're following an argument and then you're like, I heard that one before, and you switch off. It just kind of goes straight through your eyes into you.
And so often in your stories, you go to somewhere and it helps you inhabit the place, but it also helps open up the community around to you, doesn't it?
Absolutely, because people are curious. And this is everywhere. This could be sitting on the street in Brooklyn, or it could be sitting on the street in Mumbai. People want to see what you're doing. And when people talk about photos, very often they talk about taking photos, right? You like click something and then the person's image goes into your black box and you take it away. Whereas the typical way we speak about drawings is making a drawing. And when you make a drawing, people can look at it and they can comment on it. If they don't like that you're drawing them, they can walk away. It's something that people are much more interested in, something that's much more unusual, and in many ways, something that's much more collaborative.
Yes, who's next? You, sir.
Hi, Molly. Thank you so much for that wonderful session. My name is Bijoy. My question is, can you tell us a little bit about the formative artists in the comic books journalism movement who have been influential on your style in terms of, let's say, people who have written Palestine, like Joe Sacco or Art Spiegelman? Any influences that you'd like to tell us about?
Well, both of those people are, you know, gods amongst men. I love Joe Sacco, obviously. Every single time I see one of his panels, I'm like, how did you draw so many lines? My hand aches with sympathy for you. But I always actually much more influenced by people who I suppose were more, I hate the fine artist illustrator dichotomy, but more someone like Diego Rivera, the muralist, or Toulouse-Lautrec, the French painter, or Ralph Steadman, who was the famous gonzo artist who illustrated Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. I was much more interested in the single image too than perhaps I was in, the sequential comic book panel after panel style, which is something that always was like way too much work for me to do, to be quite frank. I was interested in people who drew with line, who drew recognizable things with cruelty and beauty and sarcasm. And I suppose now, I look at all sorts of things. I love Basquiat, I look a lot at Picasso, which is a cliche, but dear God, that man learned, how to paint. He mastered the classical genre when he was 10 years old. And then I'll look at other things, like, I'm here, I might look at the blue and the way that the blue and the white are on the wall against the cream, and I might think like, God, that's a beautiful color harmony. How would I use that, in a picture? How might I use that like the symmetry and the overlappingness of the vines and that? I think that anyone who's an artist who is good doesn't just look at artists. They look at the world too, and they draw all sorts of inspiration from that.
Any more arms? Yes, this young lady here in the second row. Was it a sir? I can't see from here. It's a sir. Sorry.
Hello, good afternoon, and thank you for a wonderful discussion. I wanted to ask, have you ever felt like you're being dismissed just because you're young?
Well, now that I'm old, not so much, but yeah, in the beginning. I was saying this to an interview with Scroll, but when I was 23, 24, I forget the exact year, but I went to this big comics convention called San Diego Comic Con, and I had this like little self-published, or it wasn't self-published, but it was this tiny press book. And I was so excited, and I was like, I'm gonna have my book, and I'm gonna be a star because I got a book, I'm delusional. And I signed the book, and I signed it next to older, she's about 50, very successful and established artist, a comics artist, and it was fine. And then I got back, and there was a comic about how the only talent I had was how I showed my breasts. And there was a huge thread by many 50-year-old male artists speculating on who I had had sex with to get ahead. And that was kind of my hazing into the field. I had a lot of that when I started out. And the things that changed that, first of all, was getting older, getting that look on your face, like you're not gonna stand for that anymore. I think the other thing was that I just stayed around. I didn't go away. I think that if you just don't go away, you win. If you just don't let the bastards grind you down, you win. And then the other thing, which might give someone some consolation as a journalist, is it's actually very useful for journalists to be underestimated. Because being underestimated is what lets you go on press tours in Guantanamo Bay. Being underestimated is what lets people who have something to hide think that you cannot expose them. So I've gotten a lot from being underestimated, and it's a bit of a superpower. So, all in all, what I learned from having people not take me seriously was definitely worth a message board thread.
That'd be well put. Yes, sir.
You said you were not very good initially when you started, but then you got better at it. And from your perspective, do you think it is an art, a calling, a gift, or what? Or some kind of a mission which you take up these kind of assignments which you have done?
There are definitely some artists who are just brilliant from the start. Like, you look at them and it is like God touched their hands. And I have all the respect in the world for people like that, and I've seen it. I wasn't one of those people. The thing that I do think is inborn is I think that most people in the world don't like doing things they're bad at. It's actually quite frustrating to spend, 10 years sucking at something, and especially when you were drawn to this by love of things that are good at it. And sometimes I think what artists have, like our secret gift, it's not that we are like so, genius or talented. It's that we're so stubborn. We just love it so much that we are willing to endure the fact that literally we will be terrible at this for 20 years. Imagine that. Imagine being bad at something for 20 years and still doing it every single day, for hours and hours and hours. It's like a monomania. That's what I had, I know. And that's probably the thing that I think is inborn.
Time for one more question. Who's going to ask it? Any arms up there? Yes, sir. Microphone's just coming.
I just want to know your opinion about God and how to pray, and a few lines about this.
Sorry? Can you repeat that?
I have heard that two things God has not made. One is poverty and other is racism. So what is your opinion about this?
I'm an atheist, though I respect all religions. So I don't have an opinion about God.
Well, I think, can I just say to all of you, and I'm sure you agree, that we are jolly blessed to have Molly Crabapple in the world, are we not? Not only is she incredibly gifted as a writer and as an artist, but she is incredibly brave. And in an increasingly scary world, we need people like that. People who are unafraid and prepared to voice their concerns about injustice, whether it be on her doorstep in Manhattan or in the horrors of Syria. So can we have a really big round of applause for Molly Crabapple?
Thank you so much. This was such a pleasure. Oh my God, it's one of my favorite places. Oh, also, buy our book.
And also with her, ladies and